The throne room of the multiverse did not echo with the sound of a struggle. It echoed with the sound of a collapse. Goku lunged, his body a streak of iridescent silver and jagged dragon scale, his fist aimed at the center of the Grand Priest's calm. In any other reality, that strike would have unmade a galaxy. But here, distance was a lie told by the weak. As Goku's knuckles neared the angel's face, the space between them didn't shorten. It expanded, stretching into an infinite golden desert of logic. The Grand Priest did not move. He did not raise a hand. He simply adjusted a thought. Suddenly, the concept of Goku's attack was rewritten. The kinetic energy did not vanish. It was simply told it no longer had permission to harm. Goku's fist slid off the air as if the universe itself had become a polished mirror, refusing to be cracked. Time stuttered, a skipped heartbeat in the rhythm of creation, and before Goku could draw another breath, the Supreme Angel stepped into the space where the Saiyans' guard used to be. There was no flash of light, only the terrifying sound of a law being enforced. With a single, effortless touch to Goku's chest, the dragon-scale armor, the pride of the Dragon Void, didn't just break. It apologized for existing. The shimmering plates turned to gray ash, falling away in flakes of dead light. Goku's dragon instinct, usually a roaring predator in the back of his mind, went silent, retreating into the dark like a frightened animal. He didn't just fall. He was subtracted from the sky. As his body slammed into the crystalline floor, coughing out plumes of golden ki that bled into nothingness, the Grand Priest looked down with eyes that had seen the birth of every star and felt nothing for any of them. "You fought well for a stain," the angel whispered, his voice a freezing wind. "But a stain does not dictate the color of the canvas. Before the final thread of hope is severed and the ink of this timeline dries into shadow, stay with us. Witness the moment a father's love becomes the ultimate forbidden power." The throne room of his high heavens did not resemble a battlefield. It resembled a cathedral built of frozen light and absolute silence. There was no wind here, no scent of ozone, no heat from the friction of moving bodies. In this realm, the Grand Priest was not merely a resident, he was the architect of the air itself. Every molecule of oxygen was a calculated gift, and every law of believed physics was a decree that could be retracted at a moment's notice. Goku stood at the center of this terrifying perfection, his silhouette a jagged, defiant tear in the tapestry of divinity. His dragon-scale armor pulsed with a rhythmic subterranean glow, the scales overlapping like the hide of a primordial beast. Each plate of the armor was forged from the fires of the Dragon Void, carrying the weight of a dimension where time was a broken gear. His eyes, once the soft, curious windows of a martial artist, had hardened into the predatory slits of a true dragon. He could feel the dragon seed in his chest, a heavy, thrumming heart of pure sovereignty that refused to acknowledge the authority of the angels. "I can see them now," Goku's voice rasped, a sound like grinding stones. "The strings, the laws, they aren't just in the air, they're in Xeno. They're in the way the stars move." The Grand Priest stood 20 paces away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression as unreadable as a blank page. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like a gardener observing a weed that had somehow learned to scream. To the Supreme Angel, Goku's power was not a threat. It was a grammatical error in the sentence of the universe. "Vision is a burden to those who do not understand what they see, Son Goku," the Grand Priest replied. His voice didn't travel through the air. It manifested directly inside Goku's mind, cold and perfectly polished. "You see chains, I see structure. You see a prisoner. I see a king who is finally safe from the chaos of his own whims." Goku didn't wait for the sermon to end. He knew that in this place, words were just another way to bind a man. He pivoted, his lead foot shattering the crystalline floor not through physical force but through a surge of dragon ki that rejected the floor's right to be solid. He became a blur of iridescent silver, a spear aimed directly at the Grand Priest's throat. In the mortal realms, this movement would have shattered the sound barrier 1,000 times over. But here, the Grand Priest simply blinked. Suddenly, the distance between them didn't just feel longer, it became longer. Goku was moving at a speed that could cross galaxies, yet the Grand Priest remained 20 paces away. It was as if Goku was running on a treadmill made of expanding space-time. The more Goku pushed, the more the universe retreated. He was a master of the instant transmission, a man who could fold space with a thought, yet he found himself trapped in a geometric nightmare. "Distance is a definition, Goku," the Grand Priest whispered, his image flickering slightly as he adjusted the coordinates of reality. "And I have decided that you are not close enough to touch me. You never will be." Goku's teeth bared in a snarl. He didn't pull back. Instead, he reached deep into the dragon seed, pulling a thread of power that predated the angelic law. If the angel defined distance, Goku would define the path. He let out a low, guttural roar, and the dragon-scale armor flared with a violet light. He wasn't just moving through space anymore, he was eating it. The scales on his arms vibrated, emitting a frequency that began to unwrite the Grand Priest's spatial barriers. For the first time, the Grand Priest's eyebrows twitched. A hairline fracture appeared in the air between them, a literal crack in the logic of the high heaven. Goku's fist, encased in a gauntlet of shimmering dragon hide, began to close the gap. 19 paces, 18, 17. The air began to scream. It wasn't the sound of wind, but the sound of the universe protesting a violation of its own rules. Goku's dragon instinct roared in his ears, a primal drumbeat that drowned out the angelic hymns. He could see the chains of authority now, thin golden strands of light that bled out of the Grand Priest's fingertips and wrapped around Zeno's tiny slumped form on the throne. "I'm going to break every one of them," Goku vowed, his voice a thunderclap that shook the pillars of the palace, "starting with you." The Grand Priest did not recoil. He simply sighed, a sound of profound disappointment that carried the weight of collapsing suns. As Goku's fist carved through the 16th pace, the golden strands of angel law didn't just resist. They began to weave themselves into a new tapestry. "You are attempting to use the power of the dragon to overwrite the mandate of the heavens," the Grand Priest observed. He raised a single finger, tracing a glyph in the empty air. "But you forget, son Goku. The dragon provides the breath of life, but the angel provides the rhythm. Without rhythm, the breath is merely noise." As the glyph ignited, the very concept of impact was removed from the local area. Goku's fist finally reached the Grand Priest's chest, a strike that should have sent shockwaves through every dimension. But there was no sound. There was no vibration. It was as if Goku had punched a ghost made of solidified logic. His knuckles made contact with the Grand Priest's silk-like tunic, yet the energy of the blow didn't transfer. Instead, the dragon key gathered in Goku's arm suddenly found itself with nowhere to go. It began to backflow, surging into his own muscles and bones. Goku gasped, his eyes wide as his own power threatened to tear his shoulder from its socket. This was the horror of fighting a supreme angel. They didn't need to be stronger than you, they only needed to be more correct. "Your intent is to harm," the Grand Priest whispered, leaning in until his silver hair nearly touched Goku's forehead. "I have simply deleted that intent from the physics of this room. Here, your violence is a word with no definition." Goku's dragon instinct screamed a warning, but the warning arrived in a language he could no longer translate. The Grand Priest's hand moved, not a strike, but a gentle shove. To any observer, it looked like a father guiding a child away from a flame. But to Goku, it felt as if the entire weight of the multiverse's history had been compressed into a single point and slammed into his solar plexus. The dragon's dorsal armor shrieked. The violet scales, which had survived the crushing gravity of the dragon void, began to glow a frantic, angry red. They were trying to absorb the authority of the touch, but the touch was not energy, it was a command to fall. Goku was sent spiraling backward, not through the air, but through the very fabric of reality. He saw flashes of other timelines. Worlds where he had died against Raditz, worlds where he was a king, worlds where Earth was a cinder. As he was skipped like a stone across the surface of existence. When he finally slammed back into the crystalline floor, the impact didn't just break the ground, it sent a tremor through the souls of every living being in Universe 7. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, the dragon seed in his heart pulsing with a frantic, wounded rhythm. The Grand Priest remained at the center of the room, his hands once again clasped behind his back. He hadn't even broken a sweat. Behind him, Zeno sat on the throne, his eyes wide and vacant, the golden strings pulling at his small blue and purple limbs like a marionette. "Why?" Goku managed to choke out, spitting a mouthful of silver-tinted blood onto the pristine floor. He was your king. He trusted you." "And I have repaid that trust by ensuring he can never make a mistake again," the Grand Priest replied. "A king who can erase a universe on a whim is a danger to the grand design. A king who is guided by my hand is a tool of perfect stability. You, Son Goku, represent the very whim I seek to excise. You are the variable that makes the math of eternity fail." Goku forced himself to his knees. His armor was cracked, and his ki was leaking like water from a shattered vase, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. If anything, the cold realization of the Grand Priest's betrayal had turned that fire into a white-hot star. "Stability is just another word for a grave," Goku said, his voice regaining its steel, "and I've never been very good at staying buried." Goku gathered the remaining fragments of his dragon ki, weaving them not into a fist, but into a desperate, final exhale. This was the dragon breath he had uncovered in the deepest pits of the void. Not a pillar of fire to burn the flesh, but a wave of raw existence designed to strip the permission off of reality. As he breathed out, a shimmering, translucent mist rolled across the crystalline floor. Where the mist touched the Grand Priest's golden barriers, the light didn't just dim. It vanished, as if the very idea of a wall had been forgotten by the universe. For a heartbeat, the strings connected to Zeno's limbs frayed. The king of all let out a tiny, choked gasp, his fingers twitching toward Goku. But the Grand Priest's smile only sharpened. He watched the dragon breath approach with the curiosity of an artist watching a child attempt to paint over a masterpiece. "A bold attempt to rewrite the grammar of the heavens," the angel murmured, "but you are still using the ink I provided." The Grand Priest reached out and caught the dragon breath in his bare hand. He didn't deflect it, he crushed it. Between his thumb and forefinger, the primordial mist was compressed until it became a single tiny bead of black glass. A dead concept. He dropped the bead, and it shattered against the floor with a sound that felt like a funeral bell ringing in Goku's marrow. Then the Grand Priest moved. He didn't fly, he simply decided to be where Goku was. He struck Goku once, not in the chest, but in the center of his forehead, right where the dragon instinct flared most brightly. It wasn't a blow of kinetic force, but an ontological shock. Goku felt his mind go white. The predatory focus that allowed him to see the lines of reality was suddenly smothered, as if a heavy velvet shroud had been thrown over his soul. The dragon seed in his chest, which had been a roaring engine of rebellion, was forced into a state of artificial hibernation. Goku's knees hit the floor. The dragon-scale armor didn't just crack this time, it dissolved, the shimmering plates turning into a dull, gray dust that stained his skin like ash. He looked up, his vision blurring, seeing the Grand Priest not as a man, but as a towering pillar of absolute uncaring law. "The architecture of this room is submission, Son Goku," the Grand Priest said, his voice now a booming choir that seemed to vibrate within Goku's very DNA. Every pillar, every floor tile, every breath you take is an act of obedience to the system I have built. You think you are a dragon? You are merely a bird who has flown too high and forgotten that the sky belongs to the one who made it. Goku tried to lift his arm, but his muscles felt like they had been rewritten into lead. He was no longer a god. He was no longer a Saiyan. He was a prisoner of a logic so vast and cold that it made the Dragon Void look like a playground. He was trapped in the middle of a divine machine, and he was the only part that didn't fit. The Grand Priest leaned down, his eyes devoid of malice, which was far more terrifying than any rage. "Now," he whispered, "let us see how your will holds up when the universe stops remembering your name." The silence of high heaven was heavier than any gravity Goku had ever endured. It was a sterile, suffocating quiet that didn't just fill the room, it erased the possibility of sound. Goku lay pinned against the crystalline floor, his face pressed against the cold, unyielding geometry of the palace. Every time he tried to draw a breath, the air seemed to check his credentials, finding him unworthy of the oxygen. The Grand Priest didn't move with the haste of a conqueror. He moved with the leisure of a librarian shelving a book that had been placed in the wrong section. He knelt beside Goku, his knees barely touching the ground, his silver hair shimmering like a halo of needles. "You have spent your life breaking ceilings, son Goku," the priest murmured, his voice a chilling melody of absolute certainty. "But you never realized that the ceiling was there to protect you from what lies above it. You have played at being a god, but you are still anchored by the heavy, weeping chains of your humanity." With a flick of his wrist, the Grand Priest conjured a shimmering pane of light in the air between them. It wasn't a screen, it was a wound in the fabric of the dimensions, a window that looked down through the clouds of the mortal world, past the boundaries of Universe 7 and straight onto the lush green slopes of Mount Paozu. Goku's heart, though muffled by the angel's dampening field, gave a violent, painful thud. Through the rift he saw it, the small, familiar house. He saw the laundry swaying in a gentle breeze he could no longer feel. And there, standing in the doorway, was Chi-Chi, shading her eyes as she looked toward the horizon, perhaps waiting for a husband who was currently being unmade at the top of the universe. Further down the path, Gohan sat in quiet meditation, oblivious to the fact that his entire existence had just been categorized as a clerical error by the Supreme Angel. "They are beautiful in their fragility," the Grand Priest said, his gaze fixed on the window. "Like sparks in a dark room, but sparks are not part of the architecture. They are merely a byproduct of friction, and I am tired of the friction you have caused." Goku tried to scream, but the Grand Priest simply placed a finger over his own lips. The gesture felt like a mountain being dropped onto Goku's vocal cords. "I will not kill you, Goku. To kill you would be to admit you were a threat," the angel whispered, leaning down until his eyes, vast swirling nebulae of cold logic, locked onto Goku's terrified pupils. "I will simply remove the permission for your legacy to exist. I will erase your family. I will delete your bloodline from the scroll of time. Your wife, your sons, your friends, they will not die. They will simply have never been." Goku's eyes widened, the silver of his dragon instinct flickering one last time in a desperate, dying spasm. This wasn't a battle of Kai anymore. It was a battle for the right to remember. "And when they are gone," the Grand Priest continued, his smile finally touching his eyes with a terrifying hollow light, "I will keep you here, in the hollow of my palm. You will be the only being in all of creation who remembers the names of the people I have deleted. You will be the living monument to your own failure. I will make you watch as the world continues without them until you too forget why you are crying." The window to Earth began to glow with a sickly golden light, the same light that made up the Grand Priest's authority. On the screen, the golden sigil appeared above the house on Mount Paozu, a halo of execution that Chi-Chi and Gohan could not see. Goku's spirit didn't just break, it shattered. The dragon seed within him went cold, turning into a stone of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't a warrior in that moment. He wasn't a god. He was a father, watching the shadow of a cosmic guillotine descend upon his children. The Grand Priest stood up, smoothing his tunic. "The trial is over, Son Goku. The sentence is being written." To be a god is to be a pillar of reality, a fixed point around which the chaos of the mortal world revolves. But as Goku lay broken on the floor of the high heaven, he realized that divinity was not a solid state. It was a fragile glass, and the Grand Priest had just shattered it into a million jagged pieces. The floor beneath him felt less like crystal and more like an altar of indifferent logic. Every time Goku tried to move, a fresh wave of agony rippled through his nervous system, not the burning sting of a physical wound, but the existential screaming of a soul being rejected by its environment. His Kai, once a roaring sea of violet and gold, was now nothing more than a few scattered puddles of light on the floor, leaking from his pores like the blood of a dying star. These were the shards of his divinity, cooling in the absolute zero of the Grand Priest's presence. Above him, the ceiling of the palace seemed to recede, becoming a vast, swirling vortex of angelic scripts. Goku's vision was fractured. In one eye he saw the cold, perfect marble of the throne room. In the other he saw the veins of the universe, the dragon lines he had learned to navigate, now pinched shut, as if the Grand Priest had tied a knot in the throat of creation. The silence was the worst part. In the heat of battle there is rhythm, there is breath, there is the heartbeat of the opponent. But here there was only the sound of Goku's own failure, echoing in the void where his power used to be. The dragon seed, once a sun in his chest, felt like a cold, heavy stone. It didn't pulse. It didn't hum. It lay dormant, a shard of a forbidden legacy that had been deemed obsolete by a higher authority. "Look at you," a voice drifted down from the heights of the room. It wasn't the Grand Priest this time. It was one of the angel guards, his face a mask of porcelain beauty and utter contempt. "The savior of universes, the friend of the king. You are nothing but a collection of unauthorized atoms, Son Goku. You are a glitch that has finally been patched." Goku's fingers twitched, scraping against the floor. Each movement felt like trying to lift a mountain with a single hair. He couldn't even summon the strength to look the guard in the eye. His dragon instinct, the apex predator that had guided him through the void, was now a whimpering shadow at the back of his mind. It was muted, buried under layers of angelic law that defined Goku as defeated. He felt a strange cold sensation in his extremities, a numbness that wasn't just physical. It was as if his memories were beginning to fray at the edges. The smell of Chi-Chi's cooking, the sound of Gohan's laughter, the weight of a training Jai. These things felt like they belonged to a story he had read a long time ago rather than a life he had lived. This was the unwriting the Grand Priest had promised. The shards of his divinity were being swept away, and with them the very foundation of his identity. "Stop, please!" Goku's voice was a ghost of itself, a dry rattle in a throat that had forgotten how to scream. He wasn't begging for his life. He was begging for the world to remain real. He could feel the golden sigil on Earth, even from this distance, across the borders of dimensions, burning like a brand against his spirit. It was a countdown, a divine clock ticking toward the moment his family would become a hollow space in the history of the multiverse. The Grand Priest, standing by the throne, didn't even turn around. He was busy adjusting the golden strings that bound Zeno. To the angel, Goku was no longer a participant in the scene. He was merely scenery, a broken statue in a garden of perfect order. The angel guard stepped closer, his boots clicking with a rhythm that felt like nails being driven into the floor of the universe. He reached down, grabbing Goku by the hair and forcing his head up. Goku's neck felt like a stem of brittle glass, ready to snap under the weight of his own head. "Look at him, father!" The guard laughed, his voice ringing with a crystalline purity that made Goku's ears bleed. "The hope of the multiverse can't even hold his own eyes open. Shall I finish the erasure now? It seems a waste to let such a tattered soul occupy space in your presence." The Grand Priest did not turn. He was pulling a long, glowing strand of law from Zeno's chest, weaving it into a complex knot. "Patience, Mojito," the priest murmured. "Erasure of the flesh is a mercy. Erasure of the essence is justice. Let him watch the horizon of his own life disappear first. It is a necessary part of the recalibration." Goku's gaze drifted to the floor. There, scattered around his trembling hands, were the physical remnants of his power, shards of dragon ki that looked like broken amethyst. They were dimming, their light flickering like candles in a rising gale. He tried to touch one, to pull even a fraction of that warmth back into his marrow, but his fingers simply passed through the light as if it were a holographic memory. He was losing his grip on the now. In his mind, the image of Mount Paozu was beginning to blur. The green of the trees was turning to a sterile gray. The heat of the sun was becoming the cold, white glare of the palace. He tried to say Gohan's name, but the syllables felt like jagged metal in his mouth, losing their meaning before they could hit the air. "Who am I?" The thought flickered, small and terrified. "I am a fighter. I am the father." But the father part was being shredded. The golden sigil on earth, visible through the rift in the air, began to rotate. With every revolution, a piece of Goku's history was being rewritten. He saw a vision of a house on a hill. But in the vision, the house was empty. There were no toys in the yard. There was no laundry on the line. There was only the wind. A single tear, tinted with the silver of the dragon seed, rolled down Goku's cheek and hit the floor. It didn't splash, it vanished. In this room, even sorrow was an unauthorized emotion. Then from the absolute center of his chest, inside the cold, stone-like shell of the dragon seed, there came a vibration. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was a sound deeper than biology, older than the first angel. It was the sound of a root cracking a mountain. A dragon does not ask for permission. The voice was his own, yet it sounded like it had been filtered through 1,000,000,000 years of silence. Goku's eyes, dull and glazed, suddenly twitched. Beneath the layers of angelic law, beneath the unwriting of his name, something dark and primal was refusing to be deleted. The angel guard, sensing the subtle shift, narrowed his eyes. He raised his hand, a blade of pure white ki forming around his palm. "I don't like that look in your eyes, mortal. It's time to close them forever." The white blade of this angel guard descended with the inevitability of a falling star. It was a weapon of pure decree, designed to sever the connection between a soul and its timeline. Mojito's smile was a thin, cruel line of perfection as he swung, expecting to see the final spark of the Saiyan extinguished like a candle in a vacuum. But the blade did not cut, it did not even land. An inch from Goku's throat, the white ki edge struck something that shouldn't have existed, a wall of absolute silent no. There was no flash of light, no explosion of energy, only a sudden jarring correction of the room's physics. The shards of amethyst-colored kai that had been leaking onto the floor suddenly stopped their aimless drifting. They began to vibrate, humming a low, dissonant frequency that set the crystalline floor to weeping. Goku didn't move his arms, he didn't even look up, but the dragon seed in his chest, which the Grand Priest had supposedly forced into hibernation, began to bleed. Not blood, but a thick, viscous ink of primordial power that seeped through the cracks in his spirit. This wasn't the key of the mortal realms, nor was it the god key of the heavens. It was the marrow of the first world, the substance that existed before the first angel drew the first line of the map. "A dragon," Goku whispered, and the sound caused the golden strings on Zeno's throne to fray and hiss, "does not accept the sentence of a witness." Mojito's face twisted in confusion. He pressed down with all his might, his divine authority flaring until the air around his hand began to liquefy. Yet his blade remained frozen. trapped in a pocket of reality that simply refused to recognize the angel's power. It was as if Goku had become a hole in the Grand Priest's masterpiece, a void that could not be painted over, because there was nothing there to catch the ink. "Father!" Mojito shouted, his voice cracking for the first time in an eon. He is ignoring the law." The Grand Priest finally turned. His eyes, usually as calm as a frozen sea, narrowed. He saw the unwritten man beginning to solidify. He saw the shards of divinity on the floor, the broken pieces of Goku's power, reforming not into armor but into a jagged, uneven crown of shadows. Goku's hand reached up, slow and agonizing, and gripped Mojito's wrist. The touch was cold, colder than the dragon void, colder than the space between universes. Where Goku's fingers met the angel's skin, the porcelain-white glow of Mojito's divinity began to turn gray. The angel let out a choked, high-pitched scream as he felt his very essence being unremembered by the hand of the mortal. "You told me that distance was a definition," Goku said, his eyes finally lifting. They were no longer silver, and they were no longer gold. They were a deep, swallowing black, swirling with the distant dying light of 1,000 crushed stars. "So I've decided that there is no distance between my hand and your heart." With a sudden, violent surge, the black ink of the dragon seed flooded outward. The angel guard was thrown back, not by force but by a rejection of his right to stand in that space. He slammed against the far wall of the palace, his divine robes scorched, and his halo flickering like a dying lamp. Goku stood up. His body was still broken, his muscles still torn, and his heart still bled. But he was no longer a prisoner of the architecture. He was the ghost haunting the machine. He looked toward the rift that showed Earth, seeing the golden sigil still spinning over his home. His family was still on the verge of being deleted, but the fear in his heart had been replaced by a quiet, terrible clarity. He looked at the Grand Priest, and for the first time, it was the angel who felt the weight of a gaze. "The trial isn't over," Goku said, his voice echoing through the high heavens like a promise of rain. "I haven't even begun to testify." The Grand Priest descended the steps of the throne with a grace that was offensive to the very concept of struggle. He did not rush to aid his fallen subordinate. Mojito was merely a tool that had encountered a harder surface, and the priest was already calculating the cost of the repair. His eyes remained fixed on Goku, or rather, on the black, swirling ink that was currently rewriting the Saiyans' anatomy. "You are reaching into the basement of creation, Son Goku," the Grand Priest said, his voice shimmering with a newfound razor-edged curiosity. The dragon seed was never meant to be a heart, it was a lock. By forcing it to beat, you are not evolving, you are unraveling. You are becoming a god of the before, a being of raw potential with no place in a finished universe. As the priest spoke, he raised his hand, and the golden strings attached to Zeno's throne pulsed with a blinding radiance. The architecture of the room responded. The walls began to fold inward, the dimensions collapsing into a singular, suffocating point of absolute command. He was no longer trying to guide Goku, he was trying to crush the possibility of Goku's existence between the palms of his authority. Goku felt the pressure. It wasn't the weight of a planet, it was the weight of a fact. The fact was that he was supposed to be dead. The fact was that he had lost. But the black ink flowing from his chest was a lie that the universe couldn't stop telling. It gathered around his feet, spreading across the crystalline floor like a shadow that refused to acknowledge the light. Where the ink touched the Grand Priest's golden barriers, the light didn't just bend, it decayed. The absolute command was met with an absolute refusal. Goku's breath came in ragged, wet hitches, each one a victory over the vacuum the priest had created. "You talk too much about what's meant to be," Goku panted, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. "Zeno wasn't meant to be a doll, and my family, they weren't meant to be your erasers." The Grand Priest's expression finally shifted. The mask of polite disappointment cracked, revealing a sliver of something ancient and predatory, the true face of a being who had managed the tides of time for eternity. "If you will not submit to the law of the mind," the priest whispered, "then you will be broken by the law of the heart." He turned his gaze toward the rift in the air, the window to Earth. With a casual flick of his fingers, the golden sigil hovering over Mount Paozu began to accelerate. It didn't just spin, it began to sink, the divine geometry passing through the roof of Goku's home. Through the rift, Goku saw Chi-Chi drop a plate. It didn't shatter. It faded into gray mist before it hit the floor. He saw Gohan stand up, his face contorting in a confusion that was rapidly becoming non-existence. His son's hands were beginning to turn translucent, the memories of his life being pulled out of the timeline like threads from a loom. "Save them, then," the Grand Priest challenged, his voice a cold, mocking echo. "Choose, son Goku. Do you spend your last shards of divinity trying to punch a hole in me, or do you cast your soul into the abyss to hold their fading hands?" Goku's scream was the sound of a universe tearing in half. He didn't look at the priest. He didn't look at the throne. He threw himself toward the rift, his hands outstretched, his dragon seed roaring with a black, suicidal light as he prepared to bridge the gap between high heaven and a home that was being deleted. He reached into the window, his fingers brushing against the fading reality of his son's shoulder, even as the Grand Priest raised a hand to strike his exposed back. The transition from the high heaven to the atmosphere of Earth was not a passage of distance, but a violent collision of two incompatible truths. As Goku plunged his arms into the rift, the air around his skin changed instantly. The sterile, scentless void of the palace was replaced by the smell of damp soil, the sharp tang of pine needles, and the distant hum of a summer cicada, a sound so fragile it felt like a miracle. But the miracle was rotting. Goku's hands, still dripping with the black ink-like essence of the dragon seed, reached through the golden veil. He saw Gohan clearly now. His son was standing in the middle of the yard, his eyes fixed on his own hands. Gohan's fingers were not bleeding. They were becoming transparent, the edges of his skin blurring into the sunlight like smoke. The memories of his battles, his studies, and his very name were being reclaimed by the Grand Priest's cosmic ledger. "Gohan, take my hand!" Goku roared, but his voice was stripped of its power by the rift. To Gohan, the shout sounded like a low, distorted rumble of thunder from a sky that no longer recognized its own weather. Behind Goku, the Grand Priest watched with the detached interest of an artist watching paint dry. He raised his hand, and the golden strings attached to Zeno's throne hummed a dissonant chord. "You are trying to anchor a drowning man to a sinking ship, Goku," the priest said. "By touching them, you only quicken their departure. Your dragon presence is a contaminant. The more you fight to hold them, the more the universe seeks to purge the memory of their contact with you." The Grand Priest didn't strike with a fist, he struck with a thought. A wave of correction slammed into Goku's back. It felt like 1,000 needles made of ice being driven into his spine, each one carrying a command to forget. The Grand Priest was attempting to overwrite the neural pathways of Goku's heart, to sever the emotional cords that bound him to the woman in the house and the boy in the yard. Goku's grip on the rift faltered. His vision swam. For a terrifying second he looked at Chi-Chi, who was now just a fading silhouette in the doorway, and his mind went blank. Who is she? Why does my chest ache when her light grows dim? The dragon seed in his chest pulsed, a violent, agonizing throb of black fire. It was the only thing keeping his identity from being bleached white by the angel's radiance. "She is the reason you came home," the voice from the void whispered in the back of his mind. "She is the law you chose over the stars." Goku snarled, the sound vibrating through the rift and causing the trees on Mount Paozu to shed their leaves in a sudden, unnatural autumn. He didn't pull back. He pushed deeper. His torso was now halfway through the rift, caught between the white light of heaven and the graying reality of earth. The golden sigil, the Grand Priest's mark of execution, was now hovering inches above Gohan's head. It was a halo of geometric cruelty, spinning with a high-pitched whine that set Goku's teeth on edge. Where its light touched the grass, the green turned to a static-filled void. "I won't let you!" Goku gasped, his muscles bulging until the black ink of his power began to spray from his pores like oil. He reached Gohan. His ink-stained fingers brushed against his son's translucent shoulder. The contact was a shock of absolute cold and absolute heat. The moment they touched, the Grand Priest's golden sigil flared in protest. It recognized the dragon interference and doubled its efforts. The house on Mount Paozu began to dissolve faster, the wood turning to dust, the memories of 1,000 family dinners being sucked into the golden vortex above. Gohan looked up, his eyes finally finding his father's through the shimmering distortion of the rift. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of an ocean. "Everything, it's going quiet." The sound of Gohan's voice, thin, fragile, and stripped of its Saiyan vibrance, was a blade that cut deeper than any angelic decree. As Gohan's hand began to slip through Goku's own, the physical world of Mount Paozu continued to lose its resolution. The trees became sketches of trees. The sky became a flat, featureless gray. "Don't let go, Gohan! Look at me!" Goku's roar was muffled by the crushing weight of the Grand Priest's correction pressing against his neck in the high heaven. In the palace, the Grand Priest sighed, a sound of weary finality. He stepped toward the rift, his presence causing the golden strings connected to Zeno to vibrate with a high, piercing frequency. "You are trying to hold on to a dream that has already ended, son Goku. Every second you spend reaching into the past is a second you are not preparing for your own eternity as a footnote. Look at your son. He isn't just dying, he is becoming nothing because of you." The Grand Priest raised his hand, and the golden sigil above Gohan's head pulsed. A beam of white, geometric light shot downward, striking Gohan's chest. It didn't burn him, it simply removed the permission for his heart to beat. Gohan's eyes glazed over. His grip on Goku's hand didn't just loosen, it became intangible. His fingers passed through Goku's palm like cold mist. On Earth, Chi-Chi finally stepped out from the porch, her face a mask of terror that was rapidly losing its features. She tried to call out to her husband and son, but her mouth moved in silence. The universal grammar had already deleted her ability to be heard. "No!" Goku's spirit recoiled, but the dragon seed in his chest did something unexpected. Instead of erupting in rage, it grew terrifyingly cold. The black ink flowing from his pores began to thicken, turning from a liquid into a jagged, crystalline shadow. Goku realized that if the Grand Priest was using law to erase his family, he could not fight back with mere power. He had to use a different law. He pulled his hand back from Gohan, not to let go, but to gather the black essence of the dragon seed into his palm. "You said, 'I am a god of the before,'" Goku whispered, his voice vibrating through the dimensions, shaking the very foundations of the high heaven. "The before doesn't care about your names, it doesn't care about your rules, it only knows what is real." Goku slammed his ink-stained hand into the ground of Mount Paozu, right at Gohan's feet. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The black primordial essence didn't just spread, it infected the ground. It was a dragon law that declared the area around Gohan to be sovereign, outside the reach of angelic authority. Where the ink touched the grass, the green didn't return to normal. It became a deep, abyssal violet, the blades of grass hardening into obsidian. The golden beam from the Grand Priest's sigil hit this black shield and shattered. The sound was like 1,000 windows breaking at once. For a moment, Gohan's body regained its solidity, his skin flushing with a dark, unnatural warmth as the dragon energy forced him back into existence. He is anchoring them to the void, Mojito gasped from the far wall, his halo still flickering. Father, he's turning the earth into a graveyard of the old world. The Grand Priest's face darkened. His perfect calm didn't just crack, it dissolved into a cold, focused fury. You would subject your family to the corruption of the dragon void just to keep them from my justice? You would rather they be monsters in a dead dimension than memories in a perfect one? The priest stepped onto the rift itself, his boots treading upon the boundary between worlds. He looked down at Goku, who was now hunched over, his body a bridge of bleeding black ink and broken white bone. Then I will not erase them, the Grand Priest declared, his voice becoming the roar of 1,000 dying stars. I will make the very air they breathe a poison. I will turn their love for you into the weight that drowns them. The Grand Priest did not descend to the earth. He simply leaned over the rift, his shadow stretching across the obsidian-stained yard of the Sun family home like a tidal wave of ink. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and plucked a single golden strand from the air, one of the many chains of authority that usually bound the king of all. You have anchored them to the before, Goku, the priest mused, his voice vibrating through the marrow of everyone present. But the before is a place of hunger, not life. By saving their forms, you have condemned their spirits. They are no longer part of the light, and as such, the light of this universe will now treat them as a disease. As the priest pulled the golden strand, the sky above Mount Paozu didn't just darken, it curdled. The sunlight, which had been a warm golden blanket, suddenly turned into a searing, acidic white. The very air, once filled with the scent of pine and peace, became a thin, suffocating vapor. Gohan gasped, clutching his throat. His skin, now solid thanks to Goku's black ink, began to blister where the righteous light of the sun touched it. Chi-Chi fell to her knees, her hands pressing against her chest. To the Grand Priest, her love for Goku was a tether, a line of communication he could exploit. He twisted the golden strand, and the emotional bond between husband and wife was suddenly inverted. Goku felt it instantly, a jagged, white-hot spike driven through his heart. Every memory of Chi-Chi, every ounce of his affection for her was being converted into a physical weight. On Earth, Chi-Chi screamed, though no sound came out. It felt as if her own heart was becoming a leaden stone, growing heavier with every second she looked at the man she loved. The more you love them, the more they will break under the weight of that love, the Grand Priest declared, his eyes glowing with the cold radiance of a sun that had forgotten how to warm. I have made your devotion their executioner. To save them, you must stop caring. You must let them fade into the silence I designed for them. Goku's arms, still spanning the distance between the high heaven and the earth, began to tremble with a violent rhythmic palsy. His muscles were tearing, the black ink of the dragon seed mixing with the red of his mortal blood to create a dark, shimmering ichor that stained the rift. He could hear Gohan's muffled whimpers and see the agonizing weight crushing Chi-Chi's spirit. He was the bridge, and the bridge was being pulled apart by two infinite forces. I won't... Stop, Goku gasped, his teeth cracking under the pressure. I'll carry it, all of it. You cannot, the Grand Priest replied simply. He raised his foot and pressed it down onto the center of Goku's back, right where the spine met the skull. The pressure was absolute. It was the weight of 1,000 divine decrees. You are a man who tried to be a dragon, and in doing so you have become a trap for the people you wish to protect. Look at them, Goku. Look at what your hope has done to them. Gohan lay curled in the obsidian grass, his body smoking as the very atmosphere of his home rejected his new dragon-tainted existence. Chi-Chi was pinned to the earth, her eyes wide with a sorrow so heavy it was literally shattering the ground beneath her. Goku's spirit flickered. The dragon seed in his chest gave a final desperate pulse, but the Grand Priest's foot pressed harder, stifling the vibration. The rift between the dimensions began to shrink, the edges of the window closing like a jagged mouth. No, not yet, Goku whispered, but his eyes were losing their focus. The black ink was retreating, pulled back into his body by the overwhelming correction of the angelic presence. As the rift snapped shut, the last thing Goku saw was his son reaching out toward a father who was being pulled back into the heavens. A father who had tried to rewrite the laws of the universe and had only succeeded in making the world a more painful place for his family to exist. Goku was dragged back onto the floor of the palace, his body a smoking ruin of flesh and forgotten divinity. The Grand Priest stood over him, the golden strands still wrapped around his fingers, his expression one of bored, ultimate victory. "The shadow over Mount Paozu will not lift, Son Goku," the priest said, looking down at the broken warrior. "It will only grow heavier until there is nothing left to crush." The palace floor was no longer a solid surface. To Goku, it felt like a vast frozen sea of glass, and he was a crack that the universe was trying to heal. He lay in a hollow of his own making, his chest heaving with breaths that tasted like iron and ash. The high heaven did not offer mercy to the fallen. It offered only the crushing weight of its own perfection. Above him, the Grand Priest stood as a pillar of absolute, terrifying serenity. He was not a conqueror standing over a victim. He was a scientist observing the final, frantic movements of a specimen that had outlived its usefulness. The golden strings that bound Zeno hummed with a low, vibrational frequency that seemed to harmonize with the very atoms of Goku's body, vibrating his bones until they felt like they were made of dry chalk. "The tragedy of the mortal spirit," the Grand Priest began, his voice a silver needle threading through the silence, "is its insistence on permanence in a universe built on cycles. You believe your love for your family is an anchor, Son Goku. You believe it is the foundation of your strength. But look at you now. That anchor is the very thing dragging you into the depths of my judgment." Goku tried to lift his head, but his neck felt as though it were being held down by the collective gravity of 1,000 dead suns. His vision was a fractured kaleidoscope of white light and jagged shadows. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Chi-Chi and Gohan, not as they were in his happiest memories, but as they were now. Fading, agonizing silhouettes under a sky that had turned its back on them. "I will not give up," Goku wheezed, the words tearing at his throat like shards of glass. The Grand Priest sighed, a sound of profound boredom. He leaned down, his face a mask of porcelain beauty that lacked even a glimmer of empathy. Give up is a concept for those who still have a choice. You are no longer choosing, Goku. You are merely enduring the inevitable. I have already begun the process of removing your name from the archives of creation. Even now, the Kaiotians in their distant realms are looking at the scrolls of Universe 7 and wondering why there is a blank space where a Saiyan hero used to be. The angel reached out, his fingers hovering just inches above Goku's forehead. He didn't touch him, but a wave of correction washed over Goku's mind. It wasn't pain. Pain would have been a relief. It was a terrifying, hollow numbness. Goku felt the memory of his first meeting with Bulma begin to flicker and dim. He felt the warmth of his grandfather's 4-star ball lose its texture in his mind's eye. "To break a warrior, one destroys his body," the priest whispered, his eyes swirling with the cold light of 1,000,000,000 years. "But to break a legend, one must destroy his meaning. I will leave your heart beating, Goku. I will leave your lungs drawing breath. But I will empty you of the why. You will sit at the foot of this throne, a hollow vessel, and you will watch as I rebuild the multiverse into a shape that has no room for the chaos of your kindness." Goku's spirit fractured. It wasn't the explosive break of a combatant losing a fight. It was the slow, silent cracking of a foundation under a weight it was never meant to carry. He felt the dragon seed, the core of his defiance, retreating further into the dark, its light becoming a pinpoint, a dying star in an infinite night. For the first time in his life, Goku felt the cold, oily touch of true despair. It wasn't the fear of death. He had died before. It was the fear of irrelevance. The fear that everything he had fought for, every person he had saved, and every drop of blood he had spilled was being categorized as a mistake that was currently being corrected.
Kneel,
Kneel, the Grand Priest commanded, and it wasn't an order, it was a rewriting of Goku's posture. Goku's legs, acting against his own mind, began to draw upward. His knees scraped against the crystalline floor. His pride, his Saiyan heritage, and his dragon sovereignty all screamed in protest, but they were whispers against the roar of the angel's authority. He was being forced to worship the hand that was erasing his world. The sound of Goku's knees striking the crystalline floor was not a loud one, yet it reverberated through the palace like the cracking of a world's spine. It was a sound of absolute structural failure. Every instinct in his Saiyan blood, every spark of the dragon's fire, and every ounce of the simple, stubborn pride that had carried him from the mountains of earth to the edge of eternity was being overridden. He was not just kneeling, he was being folded into the geometry of the Grand Priest's design. The Grand Priest began to pace around Goku's hunched form, his boots making no sound, yet his presence creating a crushing wake in the air. "You feel it now, don't you? The relief of the inevitable," the angel mused, his voice sounding like a soft choir echoing in a tomb. "The burden of being a hero is the delusion of choice. You believe that if you push harder, if you scream louder, the universe will flinch, but the universe does not flinch at a shadow. It simply adjusts the light." He stopped in front of Goku and reached out, his hand glowing with a soft, terrifyingly pure radiance. He didn't strike. Instead, he reached into the space just an inch from Goku's temple and pulled. Goku let out a silent, choked gasp as he felt something being extracted from the center of his being. It wasn't ki, it was a thread of gold, a memory. He saw it shimmering in the priest's palm, the image of a young Gohan laughing as he chased a butterfly in the meadows of Mount Paozu. "This," the Grand Priest said, observing the memory with clinical detachment, "is a source of friction. It creates a why that interferes with the must. By holding on to this, you maintain a rebellion against the peace I offer." The priest closed his hand. The golden thread snapped and dissolved into gray smoke. Inside Goku's mind, a room went dark. He felt a sudden, hollow ache in his chest, a shape of a loss he could no longer name. He knew he had lost something precious, but the harder he tried to remember the boy's face, the more it slipped away, replaced by the sterile white light of the high heaven. Tears of silver ichor leaked from his eyes, staining the floor, but he didn't know who he was crying for. "Stop, please," Goku whispered, his forehead pressing against the cold crystal. "Don't take the light." "I am not taking it, Goku. I am perfecting it," the priest replied. He reached in again, pulling another thread. This one was red and warm. The memory of Chi-Chi's hand in his on the night they promised to grow old together. "This too is a disorder. Love is merely a biological anchor for the temporary. In the high heaven there is no temporary. There is only the enduring." He crushed the red thread. Goku's spirit buckled. The dragon seed within him, sensing the systematic erasure of its host's soul, gave a final, desperate roar. But it was the roar of a caged beast behind a wall of thick, soundproof glass. The black ink that had once been his weapon was now just a stain on his skin, drying and flaking away. He was being bleached. He was being turned into a blank page upon which the Grand Priest would write a new silent history. The Grand Priest turned toward the throne. "Watch, Son Goku. Watch as the last of your meaning is processed." He pointed toward Zeno. The king of all was trembling. His small, colorful face contorted in a silent scream. A single tear rolled down Zeno's cheek, a tear that was quickly caught by one of the golden strings and turned into a spark of authority. The Grand Priest was using Zeno's grief as fuel to power the final erasure of Earth. "You see," the priest whispered, leaning over Goku's shoulder, "even your king helps me. His sorrow is the final ink I need to cross out your world." The Grand Priest stood over the hollowed-out shell of the multiverse's greatest warrior, his shadow falling like a shroud across Goku's trembling shoulders. The air in the palace had become so heavy with the weight of corrected history that even the light seemed to move with a sluggish, funereal grace. To the high heaven, the man known as Son Goku was no longer a person. He was a debt that was finally being settled. "The silence is beautiful, is it not?" the Grand Priest mused, his voice a soft chime in the graveyard of Goku's memories. "Without the noise of your attachments, the universe begins to hum with its original perfect frequency. You are finally becoming part of the architecture, Goku. You are the silence between the notes." Goku's head remained bowed, his eyes staring at the crystalline floor without seeing it. Inside his mind, the landscapes of his life, the orange sunsets over the southern islands, the icy peaks where he had sparred with rivals, the warmth of the small house on the mountain, were being replaced by a vast, featureless white. He could feel the names of his friends slipping through his fingers like dry sand. Vegeta, Krillin, Bulma. The syllables were losing their weight, turning into abstract sounds that no longer sparked a fire in his chest. Above him, the Grand Priest raised both hands toward the vaulted ceiling. The golden strings connected to Zeno began to glow with a terrifying ultraviolet intensity. The King of All let out a low, mournful wail, a sound of absolute helplessness that vibrated through the very marrow of the palace. The priest was no longer just guiding Zeno's hands. He was using the king's primal permission to execute a final multiversal decree. "By the authority of the throne," the Grand Priest declared, his voice echoing through every dimension simultaneously, "the variable known as the Sun lineage is hereby rescinded. Let the vacuum where they stood be filled with the peace of the unwritten." Through the fading rift in the air, a final glimpse of Earth appeared. It looked like a dying star. The golden light of the Grand Priest's sigil had expanded until it swallowed the entire horizon of Mount Paozu. There was no explosion. There was only a quiet, horrific thinning of reality. The trees, the house, and the two figures huddled in the yard were being erased as if they were pencil sketches being rubbed away by a divine hand. Goku felt a jagged final spike of agony, not in his mind, but in the very center of his soul, where the dragon seed lay dormant. It was the pain of a phantom limb. He didn't know who was being erased, but he knew that the hole they were leaving behind was larger than the universe itself. "You have won," Goku whispered, the words sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. The Grand Priest smiled, a gesture of absolute terrifying benevolence. "Victory is a mortal concept, Goku. This is simply the correction. Now sit. Watch the horizon of your soul go dark. When the last spark of your world is gone, I will give you a new name. A name that carries no weight. A name that requires no love." Goku stayed on his knees, a broken monument to a history that was being deleted. The dragon seed in his chest was cold, dark, and still. The Grand Priest turned back to his throne, satisfied that the rebellion of the Saiyan was finally over. The high heaven had triumphed. The law was absolute. But in the deepest, most shadowed corner of Goku's being, in the place where Son Goku had already died, a new, ancient heartbeat began to thrum. It wasn't the heartbeat of a man. It wasn't the pulse of a god. It was the sound of the universe's first exhale. The stars above the palace flickered, as if remembering a fire they weren't supposed to know. The high heaven had become a desert of pure, blinding whiteness. In this place, the concept of shadow was a heresy that the light sought to burn away with every passing second. Goku remained on his knees, his head bowed so low that his forehead nearly touched the crystalline floor. He was no longer the warrior who had shaken the pillars of the multiverse. He was a statue of salt, crumbling under the weight of a divine sky that refused to recognize his name. Inside his mind, the erasure was almost total. The vibrant colors of his past had been bleached into a uniform, sterile gray. He could feel the empty spaces where his brothers in arms used to stand, the hollow echoes where his wife's voice used to ring, and the cold vacuum where his son's future had been written. He was a book with its pages torn out, a vessel whose water had been poured into a thirsty sun. The Grand Priest stood before the throne, his back to Goku, his fingers dancing across the golden strings of authority with the grace of a master harpist. Each pluck of a string sent a ripple of correction through the fabric of the 12 universes. "It is finished, son Goku," the priest murmured, his voice a gentle final curtain call. "The friction has ceased. The variable has been solved. You are finally at peace, for you no longer have anything left to lose." But deep within the hollowed-out cavern of Goku's spirit, deeper than the memories, deeper than the Saiyan pride, deeper even than the soul itself, a single microscopic point of darkness remained. It was the dragon seed. The seed did not care about names. It did not care about the sun lineage or the history of Universe 7. It was a fragment of the first breath, a shard of the primal no that the universe had uttered before the first light was allowed to shine. As the Grand Priest's light tried to bleach this final speck of darkness, the seed did something it had never done before. It didn't fight, it fed. It began to drink the Grand Priest's light, consuming the very authority that was meant to erase it. Every decree of submission, every command of silence, and every wave of correction was pulled into the seed's gravity. The seed began to vibrate, a low subsonic hum that didn't travel through the air, but through the foundation of reality itself. A dragon, she does not beg for a world. A voice echoed from the bottom of the abyss. It was Goku's voice, but it sounded like it was being spoken by a mountain, by a storm, by the very blood of the cosmos. "A dragon ends the threat." Goku's fingers, which had been limp and gray against the crystal, suddenly twitched. A single drop of black ink, the essence of the dragon seed, seeped out from beneath his fingernail and touched the floor. Where it touched, the crystalline surface didn't just crack, it began to turn into something else. It became a living, breathing stone, a dark mineral that pulsated with a slow ancient heartbeat. The Grand Priest froze. He didn't turn around immediately, but the golden strings in his hands suddenly went slack. For the first time in the history of the high heaven, the rhythm had been interrupted. "What is this?" the priest whispered, a sliver of genuine alarm piercing his perfect melodic voice. Goku began to rise. It wasn't the explosive, kinetic movement of a fighter. It was the slow, inevitable ascent of a tectonic plate. As he stood, the white light of the palace began to warp around him, bending and distorting as if it were being pulled into a black hole. His skin was no longer flesh. It was a shimmering, obsidian black hide. And his eyes, the final windows of his soul, were no longer eyes at all. They were two twin points of cold, ancient authority. "You told me to become part of the architecture," Goku said. His voice was no longer a sound, it was a law. "So I decided to become the floor you stand on, and the air you breathe, and the end you didn't see coming." The Grand Priest turned, and for the first time in an eternity, the light of the high heaven flickered. It was not a dimming of the bulbs, but a stutter in the logic of the universe. He looked at Goku, the man who was supposed to be a hollowed-out footnote, and saw instead a silhouette that had begun to consume the very concept of the end. Goku's presence was no longer a vibration of ki. It was a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the angel's chest. The obsidian black hide that now covered Goku's arms and chest didn't reflect the light of the palace. It drank it, turning the radiant gold of the throne room into a bruised, sickly violet. Around his feet, the dragon law continued to spread, turning the crystalline floor into a jagged landscape of primordial rock. "You are committing a crime against existence itself," the Grand Priest whispered, his hands trembling as he tried to retighten the strings of Zeno's authority. "You are bringing the entropy of the void into the sanctuary of the first light. You will unmake everything just to spite the hand that guides it." Goku didn't answer with words, he answered with a breath. He drew in the sterile, holy air of the palace, the air that was supposed to be a gift from the angels, and held it. Inside his chest, the dragon seed didn't just burn, it inverted. It took that authorized air and stripped it of its definitions. It removed the permission from the oxygen. It removed the sacredness from the space. When Goku exhaled, it wasn't a shout or a beam of energy, it was the dragon's last breath. A wave of translucent, shimmering gray rippled outward from Goku's mouth. It moved slowly, with the agonizing deliberation of a glacier. Yet there was nowhere to run from it. Where the breath touched the air, the golden scripts of the high heaven, the floating commandments that dictated the laws of physics, simply dissolved. They didn't break. They lost their meaning. The distance the Grand Priest had used as a shield vanished. The immutability of the palace walls was forgotten. The Grand Priest raised his hands, conjuring a barrier of pure, absolute light, a wall defined as that which cannot be crossed. The dragon's breath hit the wall. There was no explosion. Instead, the wall began to turn into a soft, weeping mist. The Grand Priest's eyes widened as his most powerful decree was treated like a suggestion that had been politely declined. "I am not unmaking the world," Goku said, his voice now a low, resonant thrum that seemed to come from the floor beneath the priest's feet. "I'm just taking back the ink. You've been writing a story about cages. I'm going to write a story about the sky." Goku stepped forward. He was no longer a man walking across a floor. He was a law moving through a system. With every step, the Grand Priest's authority retreated. The golden strings connected to Zeno began to smoke and fray, the King of All's eyes slowly regaining a flicker of terrified blue light. But the cost was visible. Every inch Goku gained against the angelic authority was paid for in the substance of his own life. The black hide on his arms was cracking, leaking a brilliant, suicidal silver light. He was burning his own permission to exist as fuel to keep the dragon breath flowing. He was becoming a martyr to the very power he had claimed. "You will die for this, Son Goku," the Grand Priest snarled, his face finally contorting into a mask of true divine rage. "Even if you break my chains, you will have no soul left to enjoy the freedom." "I know," Goku said, and for a fleeting second a smile, soft, human, and heartbreaking, crossed his obsidian face. "But they'll be safe, and that's the only law I need." The Grand Priest let out a scream that was not a sound, but a tectonic shift in the frequency of the multiverse. He threw his hands forward, and the remaining golden strings, those that still held the shivering, wide-eyed Zeno, ignited. He was no longer trying to rule. He was trying to burn the house down with everyone inside. He unleashed the final decree, a white-hot spear of pure information designed to rewrite the entire history of Universe 7 into a single, static point of non-existence. Goku didn't dodge. A dragon does not avoid the storm. It is the center of it. He reached out with hands that were now composed of solid shadow and silver starlight. When the final decree struck him, the impact felt like 1,000,000,000 suns collapsing against his chest, his obsidian skin shattered, flakes of his physical form peeling away and evaporating into the void. But beneath the skin there was no more flesh. There was only the dragon law. Goku's fingers closed around the spear of light. He didn't break it. He consumed it. The black ink of the dragon seed surged up his arms, turning the white light of the decree into a dark, roaring violet. He pivoted, his body a bridge between the tyranny of the heavens and the freedom of the abyss, and he threw the energy back, not at the priest, but at the strings binding Zeno. The sound of the strings snapping was the most beautiful music Goku had ever heard. Zeno fell from the throne, his small feet hitting the floor with a soft thud that echoed like a thunderclap through every dimension. The golden halo around the king's head shattered. The dullness in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp clarity. The king of all looked at his hands, then at the man of shadows standing before him. "Ki Oku?" Zeno whispered, the word carrying the weight of 1,000 years of stolen breath. "It's okay, Zenchan," Goku rasped, his voice fading, his very outline beginning to blur into the white light of the palace. "You're free." The Grand Priest staggered back, his face a ruin of divine horror. Without the strings, without the authority borrowed from the throne, he was nothing more than a ghost in a dying machine. His halo flickered and went out. His skin began to turn to the same gray ash that had once claimed Goku's armor. "This is not the design," the priest howled, his body beginning to unravel into geometric fragments. "The design was wrong," Goku said, his hand reaching out for the final time. He didn't strike the priest. He simply touched the air in front of him and spoke a single final law: no being may bind another. The Grand Priest didn't die. He was simply removed. The universe forgot him. His name, his decrees, and his very presence were wiped from the ledger of the high heaven. He faded into a mist of forgotten definitions, leaving nothing behind but a silence that was finally truly peaceful. The palace began to tremble. Without the priest's constant artificial maintenance, the high heaven was returning to its natural state, a place of quiet observation, not control. Goku felt the last of his strength leaving him. The dragon seed had finished its work. The last breath was over. He looked toward the rift, seeing the earth, seeing a house on a mountain where the green was returning to the grass and a woman was looking at the sky. Her heart suddenly light for a reason she couldn't yet explain. Goku didn't fall, he simply let the light take him. The stars burned quietly that night over Mount Paozu, as if they were remembering a fire they weren't supposed to know. On the porch of the small house, Goku sat in his old orange gi. The obsidian skin was gone. The silver eyes were gone. He looked like a man who had simply taken a very long walk through a very dark forest. His hands were scarred, and his ki felt different, deeper, slower, like the pulse of the planet itself. Chi-Chi sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't ask about the gods or the voids or the laws of the heavens. She only knew that the weight was gone. Across the yard, Gohan sat in meditation, his eyes closed. Every now and then, he would look at his father with a strange, lingering awe, as if he could still see the faint, scale-shaped mark on Goku's hand, a mark that didn't belong to any language known to man. High above, in a heaven that no longer had a master, a single sentence remained carved into the foundation of the empty throne room, written in a script that even the angels could not erase. The sky belongs to the one who flies. Zeno visited Earth a few days later. He didn't come with guards, he didn't come with a decree, he just sat in the grass with Goku and watched the clouds move. For the first time in eternity, the king of all wasn't looking at what he could erase. He was looking at what was there. "Goku," Zeno said softly, pointing at a butterfly. "Yeah, Zenchan?" "It's pretty." Goku smiled, leaning back against the cool earth. The dragon seed was silent now. A sleeping part of his soul that would always be there, waiting for the moment the world tried to build another cage. "Yeah," Goku whispered, closing his eyes. "It really is." The wind stirred the pine needles and the universe continued its dance, unwritten, unpredictable, and finally, beautifully, alone.